What's the most impressive feat a weightlifter can do? It's an impossible question to answer, given that we have to compare athletes across such a vast range of sizes. But there are some milestones that warrant special attention. Consider the exceedingly rare feat of doing an official triple bodyweight clean and jerk. This is an exclusive club. You could comfortably fit everyone who's done this in a Honda Odyssey and still have room for me and Gregor to handle driving and mixtape duties up front. The first athlete to do so was Bulgaria's Stefan Topurov. The most recent triple bodyweight clean and jerk was in 2019 by DPRK's Myung Chol, who'd already accomplished it several times by then. Within this elite group, no one is more impressive or more famous than the great Naim Süleymanoğlu. He did his first official triple bodyweight clean and jerk at just 17 years old as a 56-kilo lifter. A few years later, he did what is probably the most impressive lift ever, 190 kilos as a 60-kilo athlete. 10 kilos over triple bodyweight. This is 190 kilos. It's an insane amount of weight, made even more impressive by the fact that it was lifted by an athlete weighing just 60 kilos. A feat like this is the stuff that legends are made of. And Naim is absolutely a legend. He's one of a handful of athletes who's transcended the bounds of sport to become an icon, immediately recognizable to millions of people around the world. In Turkey, he's appeared in everything from school textbooks to TV commercials. Aside from his extraordinary lifting achievements, he brought attention to the plight of Bulgarian Turks, something which made him a hero to Turkish people worldwide. In 2017, Naim passed away at just 50 years old. 2 years later, in 2019, a movie came out in Turkey based on a book written by Naim's brother, Cep Herkülü, directed by Özer Fayzullu. The first part of the title translates into English as Pocket Hercules, the nickname he rightfully earned. To my knowledge, this is only the second feature-length narrative film about weightlifting, the other being the South Korean film Lifting King Kong, which is maybe a topic for another day. So how do you lift 3 times your body weight, plus 10 kilos, become a hero to an entire country, and have a movie made about you? Good question. Today, we'll look at just that, the story of Naim Süleymanoğlu. We'll look at his early development in the sport, the details of his training in the infamous Bulgarian system, and consider the movie that bears his name. Plus, some thoughts on whether it's any good and whether you should check it out. I'm gonna take a crack at this real quickly. Oh no, not today. Naim Süleymanoğlu was born Naim Süleymanov on January 23, 1967, in a small village in Kırşehir province in Bulgaria. More about that name change later. He and his family were part of the Turkish minority that had been living in Bulgaria for centuries, and the region where he was born and where he grew up was predominantly Turkish. This will be important, so keep that in mind for later. In 1977, when Naim was 10 years old, he came to the attention of weightlifting coaches Enver Türküleri and Hilmi Pekunlu. Both of them say they started hearing about this young kid who was nicknamed Kalemando, which was apparently the name of a cartoon hero at the time. The other young athletes at Naim's school indicated to one or both of the coaches that they should seek this kid out. At least, that's one version of the story. Naim has also claimed, and this appears in the movie, that he was discovered while at a swimming pool. And another account from a 1984 Sports Illustrated article claims that it was Naim who started begging Enver to let him start weightlifting when he was only 9 years old. But in his biography of Naim, which admittedly has a lot of errors, Enver said that actually Naim wasn't all that interested in weightlifting, that instead he liked wrestling, table tennis, soccer, and apparently swimming. In order to entice Naim, Enver says he made a special weight category just for him at a regional competition so he could win a medal and taste victory. Young Naim weighed 22 kilos and apparently did a 25-kilo clean and jerk. Pretty impressive for 10 years old, assuming this is true. So young Naim either was or wasn't interested in weightlifting and was discovered by Enver and Hilmi, or begged Enver to take him on. I don't know. In some ways, these ambiguities only serve to deepen the mythos around him. His past becomes unknowable, and audiences can choose whatever version suits their interests. Whatever the case, by age 10, Naim entered a sports school in Kırşehir. This made him the youngest weightlifter there by several years. In Bulgaria, weightlifters tended to start at 13 to 15 years old at this time, which was already younger than those in Russia, who started at 14 to 15, and Germany, who started at 15 to 16. In fact, he was so young that the Ministry of Health's doctors said he couldn't start until age 12. That was a problem, as Enver didn't want to risk losing Naim to another sport. Basically, he got around this by saying he would use Naim as a subject for a scientific study looking at starting weightlifting with younger athletes. The Bulgarian Federation had already decided to fund a study of training 11 or 12-year-olds, but Enver convinced them that he could do the study himself using the even younger Naim. They agreed, and thus little Naim was on his way. At least, this is according to Enver. From these origins, Naim's star began to rise, and rarely if ever slowed down. At his first championship in Bulgaria, he lifted as a 44-kilo athlete, snatching 70 and clean and jerking 90 or 95 to become cadet weightlifting champion. To put it another way, by age 12, Naim was doing over a double bodyweight clean and jerk. If you look at his training from these early years, you can see there's an emphasis on specific preparation, that is, the Olympic lifts and related movements, compared to general physical preparation. Over the course of weekly training, there was roughly 2 and then 3 times as much work dedicated to specific rather than general exercises. So from an early age, 11, 12 years old, Naim was focusing on snatch, clean and jerk, and related assistance work. All this was good preparation for the next stage of his training. At about 14 years old, Naim began lifting under the most famous, or infamous, weightlifting coach of all time, Ivan Abadjiev. Few training methodologies are as polarizing or as misunderstood as the so-called Bulgarian system. To really understand this method, we need to go back, way back, to 1980s Bulgaria, when the team was at its peak. Whoa, sweet. Here we are in 1980s Bulgaria. This could also be New Jersey in like June. Anyway, at its core, the Bulgarian approach whittles down training to just a few basic lifts. Generally snatch, clean and jerk, front squat, and back squat. Power snatch and power clean and jerk may also be utilized, although the focus is always on the classic lifts. Such a reduced number of movements is the first thing that sets it apart from more traditional programs, which may feature dozens of exercises, partial lifts, block lifts, pulls, presses, and so on. The other distinguishing feature of Abadjiev's training is the frequency of attempts at maximal or near maximal weights. In the Soviet approach, it's important to do significant work in the 60 to 80% range, and maximal attempts are often restricted to certain periods of training. The Bulgarian system, by contrast, considers the attempts at 90% and above to be critical, regardless of the training period or distance from competition. There is thus a daily emphasis on near maximal and maximal attempts. But wait, this is not just some max out all day everyday shit. Abadjiev's approach and coaching style may have been a bit of a meat grinder for athletes, but it wasn't without structure. If you watch the School of Champions documentary about the 1987 Bulgarian team, which you should, and read Enver's account of Naim's training, you can see that they were tracking the reps, sets, and weights, and modifying the training based on their results. They would adjust intensities and volume and see what worked in order to squeeze the maximum results out of their athletes while keeping them psychologically sharp. Taken together, the basics of the Bulgarian system are thus the following. First, a focus on intensity rather than volume as the most important factor in training. Second, a reliance on the classical lifts, power variants, and squats, front squats in particular, rather than a large variety of assistance exercises. Third, increasing intensity by increasing the attempts at 90%, 100%, and higher. And fourth, the regular use of competition tests in training, weekly or twice weekly, to develop the psychological and tactical fitness of the athlete. Hold on. Time out for a second. Let's take these. Oh, that's better. I just need to cut in here for a second to address the enormous Dianabol pink elephant in the room. Whatever may have contributed to the success of the Bulgarian team in the 1980s, you cannot deny that performance-enhancing drugs, and anabolic steroids in particular, played a role. But it's not as simple as saying the program was successful only or primarily due to drug use. In the 1970s and 80s, when Naim was coming up in the Bulgarian system, drug use was widespread in many countries. The problem is that we don't have good evidence of how individual countries or athletes were doping. Maybe that data exists somewhere. If so, I haven't seen it. For obvious reasons, countries aren't keen to publish the drug regimens of their athletes. What we do have are hints, suggestions, admissions of guilt, and rumors, along with a handful of positive tests. The Bulgarians, for example, had 2 athletes test positive for the diuretic furosemide at the 1988 Games in Seoul, and they subsequently withdrew their entire weightlifting team. Furosemide is not per se a performance-enhancing drug, but it can be used to mask performance-enhancing drugs like anabolic steroids. So the assumption is that it was being used for this purpose rather than for its strictly diuretic properties. The same 1984 Sports Illustrated article that I mentioned earlier touches on the accusations of doping, and the team largely denies them. According to Abadjiev, the 2 positive tests from the 1976 Olympics, where 2 Americans and many others also tested positive, forced them to change their ways. But the article also notes that the team's physician prescribed steroids only twice each year, for a few weeks at a time, during the heaviest period of training to speed recovery. Although in the case of Naim, the doctor says, "He is so young we think he will have more tallness, so he is without anabolics in his life." I'm not sure he was right about the tallness. Anyway, this isn't the place for a full discussion of the issues around doping and anti-doping. That's easily its own video, if not an entire series of videos. But I want to acknowledge that ignoring the doping aspect of elite-level training is a lie by omission. Unfortunately, I can't say more because we just don't have the sources. But remember that doping played a role in this and other training programs. Naim entered this program when he was just 14 years old, training multiple times a day, 6 days a week. But consider a couple points. One is that he'd spent 4 years doing a more varied program that included exercises to develop his technique, strength, and general physical capabilities. So he wasn't going in cold, so to speak. And he was gradually acclimated to the most intense form of Bulgarian training over the period of several years. If you look at his training from 1980, this is according to Enver at least, you can see it doesn't strictly adhere to just the lifts and squats. The morning session had snatch from blocks above the knee and jerks from the rack in order to work on his particular technical faults in the classical lifts. And the evening session had some pulls. Plus there was time set aside for table tennis, swimming, and soccer in order to alleviate the psychological stress of all this training. It's kind of ironic that additional training is included to alleviate the stress of training, but I digress. The intensity of this training varied during the course of the month. The first week was heavy, the second week light, the third week moderate, and the fourth week heavy. In subsequent years, the volume and intensity increased as Naim adjusted to the program. Look at the extraordinary intensity of Naim's program by 1986, once he'd been in the Bulgarian system for several years. At least this is according to Enver. The training has him exceeding world records several times a day, multiple days a week. There are snatch waves to 150 and 155, for example, and clean and jerk waves to 190 and 195. All while doing back and front squats as well. As the results show, Naim adjusted very, very well. At 15, he won the Junior World Championships in the 52 kilo class with lifts of 110 and 140. At 16, he set his first senior world record with a 160 clean and jerk in the 56 category. At his first senior worlds in 1983, still 16, he did 130 and 160 for a 290 total, again as a 56, winning silver. Although according to his brother, he was intentionally held back so that the Soviet Armenian lifter Oksen Mirzoyan could win. Who knows? Curiously, and disappointingly in my view, the movie ignores this second place finish. The competition is shown, along with a misloaded barbell incident, but there's no mention of Naim losing to Oksen. This is unfortunate, since according to Enver, this defeat at the 1983 Worlds was part of what gave Naim such an intense drive to be a champion. Enver even makes a point of saying he always trained more like someone who'd lost their most recent competition, rather than like someone who just won. But, as we'll get to, this isn't really a movie about Naim the athlete, at least not at its core. Just a few months after the 1983 Worlds, Oksen and Naim would face each other again at the 1984 European Championships. This time, Oksen bombed in the snatch, while Naim won gold across the board, doing 130, 167.5 for a 297.5 world record total, 30 kilos more than second place. At this rate, Naim was well on his way to becoming an Olympic champion in 1984. But there was a problem. It's easy to say this in retrospect, but all indications suggest that had Naim gone to the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles, he would have won them, and won them easily. Unfortunately, the Soviet led a boycott of the Games that ultimately numbered 14 countries, including Bulgaria. Whether in retaliation for the US-led boycott of the 1980 Games in Moscow, or for the official reason of security concerns, or for some other reason, the result was the same. Many of the world's best athletes, and weightlifters in particular, would not be present. The Soviet bloc ended up hosting their own sports festival after the LA Games, called the Friendship Games, and here Naim did 132.5 and 165 in the 56 kilo category, 30 kilos more than the gold medal winner at the LA Olympics. But the Friendship Games weren't the Olympics, and according to Enver, Naim worried he'd never be Olympic champion, despite being just 17 years old and having been in the sport for less than a decade. While I never had a chance to speak with Naim about the 84 Games, or about anything, I have talked with American athletes who were affected by the boycott of the 1980 Games. Their trajectories varied afterward, but for all of them, the lost opportunity had a profound impact on them.
What they took from me was my opportunity to march into the stadium with all the other athletes under our flag, to go on a platform and represent my country in an Olympic Games, which is what I dreamed about for 10 years. But for many of us, hundreds of us, this was our only Olympics. And some of them really took it I took it hard, I didn't like it, but you go on with your life, you have to. But some people took it even harder than that. And I think it affected some people's lives too, unfortunately.
It's ruined my life, but that's, that's what I want to do.
Naim would get to be Olympic champion 3 times, but it wouldn't be for Bulgaria. I mentioned earlier that Naim was part of the large Turkish minority living in Bulgaria, and I mentioned that this would be important later on. Well, we've reached later on. A full history of the Turkish peoples in Bulgaria is beyond both the scope of this video and my knowledge of the subject, but let's get a few basics down. Turks and other Muslim minorities had been living in Bulgaria for centuries, at least as far back as the 14th century, when the region was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. In communist Bulgaria, from about 1944 to 1990, the situation for Turkish minorities shifted over time. Initially, they were recognized as having equal rights, even as they maintained a separate Muslim Turkish identity within the Bulgarian state. But that approach was pretty short-lived. Subsequent decades saw some instances of forced emigration, some efforts at reintegration, and a steady decline in how much the government tolerated Turkish language and culture. By the 1970s and 80s, the goal had shifted to forcibly integrating Turks into Bulgarian society, and in doing so, actively suppressing manifestations of Turkish or Islamic culture. This was officially framed by the Bulgarian state as a process of revival. That is, Turkish and other minorities were suddenly remembering their roots as Bulgarians and were thus voluntarily choosing to integrate and reject their supposedly backward folk traditions. In reality, this was the state doing all it could to erase the existence of a minority group and have them deny their culture and history. The Turkish language was forbidden, Turkish forms of dress, music, and customs had to be renounced, mosques were closed, and Turks were forced to change their names to more Slavic names. It's worth noting that while the state tried to portray this as a voluntary effort by the Turks, in reality it was imposed administratively, often with violence. Thus, in 1985, Naim Süleymanoğlu was given the new name of Naim Süleymanoğlu.
Аплодисменти за Наум Süleymanoğlu.
Publicly, he had no choice but to accept this. Again, the state could and did use violence against the Turks. Privately, according to both Enver and Naim's brother, Naim was heartbroken at this name change and at the widespread oppression and violence against his people. It was this factor that ultimately led to Naim's story turning into a quasi-espionage movie. According to some sources, there had been talk of getting Naim to defect from Bulgaria as early as 1985 at that year's World Cup. For whatever reason, it didn't happen then, but the following year, in 1986, it did happen, at the banquet following the World Cup in Melbourne, Australia. In the film's version of events, this includes Naim running out of a back door while his handlers are distracted, a foot chase through kitchens and back hallways, and then a high-speed car chase, all accompanied by the energetic soundtrack of Vivaldi's Winter. In reality, Naim just walked out. Like he said he had to go to smoke or use the bathroom or something, and then just left. A car was waiting for him, and that was it. It wasn't until the next morning that anyone even noticed he was gone. I guess maybe it's easy to misplace athletes in the lighter weight classes? I don't know. In any event, there was no foot chase, no high-speed car chase, and Naim was probably thinking more of mid-80s club hits than Vivaldi. But it was probably stressful, and for the sake of cinematic license, we can perhaps appreciate the decision to make this into something out of an espionage movie, which in some ways it was. Once his disappearance was discovered, allegedly when Abadjiev was checking on his athletes at breakfast, the Bulgarian state flipped the fuck out, to put it mildly. This was a legitimate catastrophe for them, and it sounds like they pulled out all the stops in trying to locate their misplaced athlete. By the time Naim resurfaced, he was at the Turkish consulate, after hiding out in the house of people who'd helped him defect. He was granted asylum by Turkey, and ultimately the private plane of Prime Minister Turgut Özal was sent to meet Naim in London and bring him to his new country. In Turkey, he was welcomed to a standing ovation. A press conference was held in which he spoke of the cruelty of the Bulgarian policies toward his fellow Turks. He subsequently rejected his Slavic name of Naim Süleymanoğlu and took a new name that reaffirmed his Turkish identity, Naim Süleymanoğlu. Freed from the oppressive Bulgarian regime, he was ready to begin his career as a Turkish athlete, one who could bring awareness to the plight of his people. The Bulgarians were, as you might expect, not happy. They spent a fair amount of time trying to discredit him, trying to claim he'd been kidnapped, apparently even claiming he'd been drugged, and that they feared for his health. None of this worked in discrediting Naim or getting him back to Bulgaria. But they could prevent him from competing in the Olympics. For Naim to be eligible to compete at the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, the Bulgarians had to allow it, per the rules of the time. This took some convincing, although ultimately, the universal language of international sports won out: money. Lots and lots of money. According to all accounts, the Turkish government paid Bulgaria just over
$1 million
for them to let Naim compete for Turkey. From a sporting perspective, the country probably got its money's worth. At the 1988 Games, Naim absolutely killed it. Lifting in the 60-kilo class, he opened with 145 in the snatch, after everyone else had finished. From here, he went on to a world record 150.5 and then 152.5 for another record. In the clean and jerk, he opened with 175, all but guaranteeing victory. Then he jumped to 188.5 for a new world record. And on his third attempt, he did that incredible 190 kilos. Triple body weight plus 10 kilos. He won by 30 kilos, and his total would have also won the next highest weight class, and would be at least top 10 in every category up to and including the 90-kilo class. For all the movie's creative liberties, this scene of the 88 Games is the most unforgivable. It's portrayed as a back and forth between Bulgaria's Stefan Topurov and Naim Süleymanoğlu, with the lifters taking turns on their snatch attempts. In reality, Naim took his first snatch after everyone, including Topurov, had finished. This wasn't a stressful volley of attempts. It was the greatest performance by one of the greatest weightlifters of all time. Topurov never had a chance of beating Naim. And while this competition doesn't fit traditional narratives of closely matched sporting contests, it is nonetheless a breathtaking spectacle to watch. Why not portray it thus? The movie seems to revel at times in the superiority of Naim, yet it creates a false tension during what was demonstrably his most impressive athletic feat ever. There is more to the Naim story. He went on to win 2 more Olympic golds, along with various other championships and records, but the movie more or less ends with the 1988 Olympics and subsequent events. So now is a good time to reflect on it more generally. How is it? Should you watch it? Well, to my knowledge, this one movie is 50% of all narrative feature films ever made about weightlifting. So if you want to watch a weightlifting movie, it's pretty much this or Lifting King Kong.
앉아서 절 알아보시는 갑네요.
And it's a well-made movie that looks pretty good and features some solid performances, especially by Hayat Van Eck, the actor who portrays Naim, and Selen Öztürk, who plays his mother. But it's important to consider the context in which this was made. It's a Turkish film about a Turkish hero, primarily, but not exclusively, made for a Turkish audience. And although the central character is a weightlifter, it's not really a film about weightlifting. This isn't necessarily unusual. Lots of sports films use sport as a proxy or an allegory to say something about the world outside of athletics. In American films, for example, sport and sporting success is often a proxy for mainstream views about the American dream. That is, work hard, play fair, and you'll succeed, independent of contextual and circumstantial factors. Never mind that only a tiny minority of people actually achieve success or upward mobility through sports. The point of many films is to sell us this utopian reality where sports make anything possible. Never forget that time some Italian-American bum from Philly single-handedly ended the Cold War.
Everybody should change.
So what is the Naim movie about, if not weightlifting? I have some thoughts, but remember that I am not the target audience. There are two scenes at the film's start that I think are important to understanding it. The first occurs at the very beginning, when we see a young Naim swimming in a river and then running to meet his mother, who gently chides him for not listening to her. These idyllic moments of childhood and family interactions are exactly what Naim will lose once he begins his training as a weightlifter. Süleymanoglu himself noted this, according to sources. After winning the 1989 World Championships, he lamented, "I envy children. Everything I remember is only training and championships. I gained gold medals and I lost my childhood." Also remember that this is based on a book by his brother, who would have lost Naim as a family member in some sense when he moved away to live at the sports school at only 10 years old. The other important scene is just a few minutes later, when Naim's father brings home a television. More than just a moment of familial excitement, the arrival of the television anticipates the way Naim will become a national and international star for Turkish people everywhere, thanks in large part to the dissemination of his image on TV. We can see this at the end of the film. The rows of cameras from major news networks indicate the reach of Naim's voice, and how he has gone from being a viewer to the person being viewed. Shortly before this scene was that of the 1988 Olympics, another moment when Naim's image was sent around the world. The movie is working within this realm of image and myth-making, illustrating how far Naim has come from his origins in a small Bulgarian village. TV made this possible. The advent of television meant sports could be experienced visually by far more people than could ever fill a stadium. Literally millions of viewers could and did simultaneously share in a moment of cultural significance, one like Naim's gold medal at Seoul. But here's where this can get complicated. By recreating iconic scenes from history that did happen, and by filming and editing certain competition scenes to look and sound almost like a real television broadcast, the film downplays its constructed nature and can appear more truthful than it really is. Remember, sports films, and all films really, aren't just presenting an unfiltered reality. They are carefully crafted to evoke specific responses from audiences. In the case of this film, it's working hard to create feelings of sentimentality, inspiration, and Turkish nationalism, all wrapped up in one of the most recognizable figures from the country's history. Take, for example, this scene, in which a representative of the, quote, American Weightlifting Federation and the American Olympic Committee offers Naim a car, 2 homes, $1 million cash, and a $9 million check if he will emigrate to the United States and lift for the Americans. Naim, ever the faithful hero to his homeland, turns the offer down.
It's all yours.
Hepsi senin.
Çok güzel teklifler de ben kabul edemeyeceğim. Ben Bulgaristan'da zulüm görenlerin sesini duyurmak istiyorum. Bu markaların adını değil.
As far as I can tell, this is pure fantasy. I reached out to Harvey Newton, who was the executive director for USA Weightlifting from 1982 to 88, and he'd never heard any stories related to Naim and American efforts to recruit him. In his words, quote, "I can guarantee you that we made no effort to recruit Naim as an athlete during my time with the Federation." But the scene does build up the idea of Naim as someone who is fiercely dedicated to his homeland and his people, which, as the evidence suggests, was absolutely true. And that brings us to the central motivation of Naim in the film. His goal throughout the movie is not necessarily winning gold. It's raising awareness about the oppression of the Turkish minority at the hands of the Bulgarian government. Sport is the tool, not the end goal. And this was certainly part of who the real Naim was. On a goodwill trip to the United States after his gold in Seoul, he spoke with reporters and correspondents at the United Nations about the human rights abuses taking place in Bulgaria. But the movie does flatten Naim out into a one-dimensional character, which I think is unfortunate. By most accounts, Naim loved having a good time. It's not hard to find sources mentioning his fondness for discos and going out drinking. Enver's book mentions a few outings, including an all-night drive to take his teammate Angel Gunchev to visit his girlfriend that resulted in their car ending up in a ditch. According to Enver, Naim was one of the best practitioners of the weightlifting slogan that rest gives birth to a champion. None of this is presented in the film. Perhaps this is because his love of drinking and smoking likely contributed to his dying at just 50 years old, due to complications from a liver transplant necessitated by liver failure. Nor does the film grapple with the question of why some athletes struggle with life after competition, and what role the public plays in making such transitions difficult for athletes. Being a public figure, a hero in Naim's case, is not always easy. But the way we treat our famous athletes and what we expect of them, both in and out of competition, is a difficult subject. Plenty of movies ignore it, as do plenty of fans. In some ways, I can't help but think of the 2008 film The Wrestler, which is among the best portrayals I've seen about the difficulties of finding an identity after an athletic career.
When can I get back in the gym and start working out?
As far as the exercise goes, it's still okay, as long as it's moderate.
Doc, I'm a professional wrestler.
That's not a good idea.
You hear them? This is where I belong.
But Cep Hercülü isn't that kind of film. It's a utopian sports film, inviting us to believe in the transformative power of sport and sweeping the messy bits out of sight. And that's fine. Not everything needs the brutal honesty of a film like The Wrestler. But I can't help but wish for a more nuanced portrait of one of the greatest athletes to ever lift a barbell. Finally, the question you've all been waiting to ask. How's the lifting and how are the training montages? Let's just say it probably won't be putting ATG out of business anytime soon. Thank you all so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. I also want to thank Bruce Clemens for providing some photos, Harvey Newton for answering questions about Naim in the US, and Group 3 Barbell in Madison, Wisconsin for letting me load 190 kilos in their space. To reiterate one point, there are a lot of sources on Naim, and a lot of them have slightly different or even contradictory accounts. If you want to see my sources and follow up on them, I'll provide a link below to my research. Finally, thank you so much to all our Patreon supporters. If you want to see more videos like this and be part of a community of great weightlifting fans, check out our Patreon page. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Does anyone need this? 190? No? I'll leave it just in case. I'm going to leave it.